Exploring the dark woods. Growing up in a small, boring town has its perks and its downsides. The downside was mostly the lack of excitement. There were no big attractions or events to keep us entertained. But the upside was that we lived just a short bike ride away from a vast national forest. It was a place that felt almost magical, where we could lose ourselves for hours, wandering under the towering trees and exploring the mysteries of nature. It was only a 10-minute bike ride from my house, and with nothing better to do, my friends and I spent countless weekends there. When I think back on those days, I remember the thrill of riding my bike to the forest, the wind whipping through my hair, and the anticipation building as we approached the edge of the woods. We would leave our bikes in a little dirt circle at the end of the road and venture into the trees, ready for adventure. The forest was our playground, a place where we could let our imaginations run wild. We didn't have smartphones with Google Maps back then, which meant we had to rely on our instincts and the simple joy of exploration. Sure, it wasn't the safest hobby. We often got lost and had no way of knowing how to get back. But with each visit, we became more familiar with our surroundings, and the forest felt like a second home. One summer, I remember distinctly, it was the first day of summer break, and I was excited to finally be free from school. I was 15, and my good friend Jason was over for a sleepover. We had planned a night full of video games and snacks, ready to kick off the summer in style. As the clock ticked toward midnight, we were fully immersed in our game. The excitement of summer buzzed in the air. Just as we were about to conquer the next level, the power cut out. "Seriously?" I groaned, slumping back onto the couch. My dad woke up and stumbled into the living room, rubbing his eyes. "I'll check the breaker," he said, grumbling about the neighborhood-wide outage. It was no use. After several minutes of fiddling with the switches, he sighed and returned to bed. We were wide awake and definitely not ready to sleep. We had just chugged energy drinks, fully prepared to pull an all-nighter. After a few minutes of boredom, Jason turned to me with a wild look in his eyes. "Have you ever been in the forest at night?" I raised an eyebrow. "What?" "No, we've never done that." It was such a strange and random question, but somehow it felt like an adventure waiting to happen. I realized we had lived in this town for years and had never once explored the forest after dark. The thought sent a thrill of excitement through me. "Let's do it," I said, my heart racing. We grabbed my empty backpack and stuffed a couple of flashlights inside, then hopped on our bikes and rode to our usual entry point into the forest. The thrill of doing something so daring felt electrifying. When we arrived, we noticed an old SUV parked further up the road. It looked like it might have broken down, and all the lights were off. We exchanged curious glances, but our excitement was too great to let it bother us. "Maybe it's abandoned," Jason said, shrugging it off. We parked our bikes and made our way into the trees. As soon as we stepped inside, the darkness enveloped us, swallowing the last remnants of the moonlight. We had to switch on our flashlights immediately. The contrast between the bright outside and the pitch-black forest was striking. I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and fear. "It's so dark in here," Jason exclaimed, shining his flashlight around. "Yeah, it's like a whole new world," I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the silence. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the forest came alive. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the faint sounds of creatures scurrying around filled the air. It was eerie but exhilarating. We moved cautiously, the beam of our flashlights illuminating the gnarled tree roots and tangled underbrush. It was thrilling to step into the unknown, to feel the adrenaline coursing through our veins. For the first few minutes, we were completely captivated. We joked about how cool it was to explore at night, how different everything looked under the flashlights. But as we ventured further in, the excitement began to fade. I couldn't shake a growing unease. It felt as if the forest was watching us. "Do you feel that?" I asked Jason, trying to keep my voice steady. "What?" he replied, shining his flashlight deeper into the woods. "I don't know. It just feels different. Creepy, almost." He nodded, his expression growing serious. "Yeah, I feel it too." We continued walking in silence, the once fun adventure turning a bit more serious. With each step, the ambience shifted, and the sounds around us seemed to become more unsettling. Just when I thought we should turn back, a loud snap echoed from the left. My heart skipped a beat. We both swung our flashlights toward the sound, and in the beam of our lights, we saw a figure standing about 40 feet away. "What the heck?" Jason whispered, his eyes wide with shock. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure was a man, standing still and watching us. He wore a black leather jacket and a cap pulled low over his long hair. But what stuck with me the most were his eyes. They were disturbingly wide open, like he was staring into our souls. We exchanged a glance, our hearts racing in sync. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know," Jason replied, his voice trembling. "I think we should go, like right now." His words snapped me out of my paralysis, and without thinking, I turned around and bolted back the way we came, Jason right behind me. We covered our flashlights with our shirts to dim the light, not wanting to attract his attention. Panic surged through me as we hurried through the dark, every rustle of leaves feeling like it was right behind us. Finally, we reached our bikes, and my heart sank as I glanced up the road. The SUV was gone. "Where did it go?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Jason urged, hopping on his bike. We rode hard, not stopping until we reached my house, the adrenaline still pumping through us. Once inside, I locked the door, my hands shaking. We didn't speak about what had just happened. We were both too shaken. I really wish we had told someone, but in the chaos, we figured no one would believe us. What would we even say? "Hey, we saw a creepy guy in the woods with a shovel?" No one would take us seriously. We sat in silence, the reality of our encounter sinking in. I couldn't help but feel that if we had stayed any longer or gotten any closer, things could have ended very differently. From that day on, I avoided the woods. I could never shake the feeling that something sinister lurked within those trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting adventurer. The cabin in the Rockies fast forward a few years, and I found myself in another kind of adventure. I had bought a cabin in Idaho, nestled right on the western edge of the Rockies. It was a small, cozy place surrounded by towering trees and majestic mountains. I went there a few times a year to escape the chaos of life and enjoy the peace of nature. The cabin was my sanctuary, a place where I could relax, read, and enjoy the beauty of the outdoors. In 2019, I drove 8 hours north to the cabin. I arrived around 8 p.m., the sun beginning to set behind the mountains, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. The last mile was down a dirt road, which could be tricky to navigate if overgrown, but luckily, I made it without any issues. Once I parked, I turned on the generator at the side of the cabin and unloaded my luggage, the excitement of a weekend getaway bubbling inside me. As I stepped inside, I noticed it was a bit colder than I had expected. When I flipped the switch for the lights, I froze. One of the windows in the back of the living room was broken, the glass lay shattered all over the floor. A wave of concern washed over me. I quickly did a walkthrough of the cabin, checking every room, and to my relief, everything else seemed in place. Nothing was missing. and there were no signs of anyone having broken in. Must have been an animal, I thought, trying to convince myself. Maybe a curious bear. Everything else in the cabin was just as I had left it, so I figured it was an isolated incident. I didn't want to worry too much about it, so I just grabbed a throw blanket and nailed it over the broken window. After that, I went outside one last time to gather some firewood. I piled it in the fireplace and got a warm fire going, the flames crackling and filling the cabin with a cozy warmth. Once I was satisfied with the fire, I settled onto the couch with a book, ready to enjoy a peaceful evening. With the broken window, I could hear the soothing sounds of nature outside. The rustling leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl created a perfect backdrop to my reading. I could feel the stress of everyday life melting away. Before I knew it, sleep began to tug at my eyelids. I glanced at the clock. It was already 11 p.m. I added a few more logs to the fire and turned off the lights, heading to bed and setting my alarm for 7 a.m. In the middle of the night, I suddenly jolted awake. My heart raced as I glanced at my nightstand clock. It read 1:24 a.m., and I was disoriented, unsure if I had just awakened from a bad dream. The cabin was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire. Curious, I got out of bed and cautiously opened the door to check outside. The glow from the fire cast eerie shadows across the walls, and I noticed that the blanket I had hung over the broken window had fallen to the floor. I walked over to it and froze. Mud. There were muddy boot prints all over the blanket. Panic surged through me as I knelt down, my heart racing. I followed the tracks with wide eyes, my breath quickening as I noticed they went straight down the hallway toward my bedroom. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What was going on? I turned back to the living room, feeling a wave of fear wash over me. I glanced at my bedroom door, and my heart stopped. The tracks led right into my room. Overwhelmed, I knelt down to look under the bed. That's when I saw it, a shadowy outline of a hand. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back in terror, slamming against the doorway, my heart racing. I needed to get out. I grabbed my car keys and bolted out the front door, not even thinking about my phone inside. I jumped into my truck and sped down the dirt road, my mind racing. I needed to report this. I needed help. The nearest town was about a half-hour away, and the entire drive felt like a blur. Once I reached the town, I quickly found a police station and reported the break-in. The officers were kind, but as they took my statement, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. I wanted to scream that I wasn't making this up, that something had invaded my space, but instead, I just nodded and tried to sound calm. "Can you describe the person?" one officer asked. "I didn't see their face, just a hand," I stammered, my voice shaky. I woke up, and the boot prints were right there. I think someone was in my room. The officers promised to send someone to investigate, but deep down, I felt a sense of dread. I knew whoever had been in my cabin was long gone. When we returned to the cabin an hour later, the place was silent. The officers searched the area but found nothing. No signs of a break-in, no boot prints in the dirt outside. It was like nothing had ever happened. I stood there, trembling, a sense of unease settling in my stomach. "What do I do now?" I asked one of the officers, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "Keep the doors locked, and if you see anything suspicious, call us. But it's probably best if you don't stay here tonight." I couldn't argue with him. I felt like a coward, but I knew I couldn't spend another night in that cabin, not after what had just happened. I drove back to town and checked into a motel, unable to shake the feeling that something had watched me while I slept. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions. Who was in my cabin? What did they want? Why were they under my bed? I had no answers, only fear. The next day, I made the decision to head back home. I didn't know when I would return to the cabin, but the idea of someone lurking in the woods made my skin crawl. For the next 2 years, I couldn't bring myself to return. I thought about selling the cabin. I even put it on the market, but I couldn't bear the thought of someone else getting hurt there, so I took it off the market. I locked the door and left it behind. It remained untouched, abandoned in the woods, and each time I thought of it, I felt a pang of regret mixed with fear. Every now and then, I'd hear rumors from locals about strange happenings in the forest. People claimed they saw shadowy figures darting between the trees at night. Some said they had heard whispers in the wind, echoing through the darkness. It only fueled my fear and confirmed what I had felt that night in my cabin. As the years passed, I thought about returning to face my fears, to reclaim the cabin as my sanctuary. But every time I made plans, a sense of dread would wash over me. What if whoever had invaded my space had returned? What if the forest held more secrets than I was ready to uncover? It was almost like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Now, 5 years later, the cabin remains abandoned, waiting for someone brave enough to take the plunge. I'm almost sure it's had unwanted visitors during that time. Each time I think about it, I feel a mix of longing and fear. But then again, some adventures are best left untouched, buried under the trees of a forest that holds more mysteries than I could ever hope to uncover. Story 3, by Anonymous. Back in 2021, I decided to take a road trip to Maine. It was a spontaneous choice. I had never been there before, but I had heard so many great things about its beautiful landscapes and stunning camping trails. The idea of spending time in nature, away from the noise of the city, was incredibly appealing. I had a few specific camping trails in mind that I really wanted to explore, and I felt excited about my adventure. Now, here's where my plan fell apart a bit. I didn't even bother booking a hotel for the night. My thought process was simple: drive straight to Maine, hit the trails, and camp under the stars. It sounded perfect in theory, but looking back, I realized it wasn't the best idea. On the day of the trip, I hit the road early, filled with enthusiasm. The drive was long but enjoyable. I listened to my favorite music and the sounds of the tires humming on the asphalt. As the miles rolled by, I found myself daydreaming about the peaceful moments I would spend surrounded by trees and the serene sounds of nature. However, as I got closer to my destination, I realized I was running late. Traffic slowed me down, and I didn't account for the time it would take to navigate the winding roads. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was already around 5 p.m. The trail to the campsite was supposed to take about 4 hours to hike, which meant I would be walking in the dark for a portion of the journey. I had packed my headlamp, so I wasn't too worried about being out after dark. But the idea of rushing through the woods made me uneasy. I looked around the trailhead and noticed something strange. There were no other cars parked there. It felt eerie, like I had arrived at a place no one else wanted to go. But I was determined to start my adventure, so I shrugged it off and set out. As I walked, I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The trail was beautiful, lined with tall trees and vibrant green underbrush. I tried to take in the scenery as I hurried along, but my mind kept racing. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, and I felt the pressure of time closing in on me. I quickened my pace, pushing myself to keep moving. About 2 hours into my hike, the sun began to set. I could see the sky changing colors, painting hues of orange and pink. It was beautiful, but I knew I needed to find a place to set up camp before it got too dark. As the light faded, I felt a growing sense of urgency. At around 8 p.m., the sun was almost completely gone, and I decided to take a short break. I found a fallen tree just off the path and sat down to rest. I took a few sips of water, grateful for the chance to pause. As I reached for my headlamp, something made me stop. I heard leaves crunching behind me. My heart raced as I quickly turned on my light and shined it in that direction. There was nothing there, just shadows and trees. The sound had stopped, leaving the forest eerily quiet. I tried to convince myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, a small voice of doubt lingered in my mind. After a few moments of hesitation, I stood up, adjusted my headlamp, and continued down the trail. The darkness crept in more quickly than I expected, and soon I could barely see anything beyond the small beam of light from my headlamp. The trees loomed around me, tall and silent, and I focused hard on making sure I stayed on the trail and didn't lose my footing. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Several times I stopped, convinced I heard footsteps behind me. Each time, I turned around and waited, straining to listen, but there was nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was I going crazy? Or was I really being stalked by something in the woods? As I continued walking, I grew increasingly uneasy. I had expected to reach the campground by now, but it felt like I was still far from my destination. I was also starting to worry about the battery on my headlamp. I didn't want to be caught in total darkness without any light. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard it again, this time, much closer. It was unmistakably a human footstep, and my heart nearly stopped. I froze, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and turned abruptly to see who or what was there. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. My tiny headlamp cast a weak glow, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. "Hello, is someone out there?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. The only response was the chorus of insects, their chirping growing louder, drowning out any other sounds. I started to back away slowly, still facing the direction of the sound. Each step felt heavy, and I was filled with dread. After taking about 10 steps back, I heard another quiet footstep, this one slightly to my right. I swung my light over in that direction, and in that instant, one of the bushes near me jerked suddenly, rustling violently as if something had been startled. For a fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of a leg as someone sprinted away into the thick woods. My heart raced, and panic surged through me. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. After a few long, agonizing seconds, I snapped out of my shock and turned to run. I hurried down the trail, my breath quickening as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. The fear coursing through me was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to keep moving. I knew I needed to find a safe place to hide, and fast. A mile up the trail, I spotted a small clearing that seemed hidden from view. I quickly set up my camp there, trying to make myself as discreet as possible. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I felt completely on edge. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I had gotten away, but sleep eluded me that night. Every rustle and creak in the woods kept me on high alert. I didn't hear or see anything else, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. It was clear to me that someone had been stalking me, and the thought of it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the idea that if I had made it to the campground, they might have been waiting for me, or might have followed me there later in the night. As dawn broke, the light of day slowly chased away the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few moments, just in case. The hike back to my car felt endless, and I stayed alert, my heart racing with every sound. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a rush of relief wash over me. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and took a moment to catch my breath. Looking back at the woods, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and gratitude. Whatever intentions that person had, I was lucky to have escaped. As I drove away from that place, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be venturing into those woods alone again.